The colonel's voice cut across the parade ground like artillery fire at dawn. "Get away from those trees. Now." The old groundskeeper didn't flinch. His weathered hands remained buried in the dark Virginia soil, fingers working around the roots of the youngest oak with a precision that seemed out of place for a man in mud-stained work pants and a faded chambray shirt. What Colonel Bradley Whitmore III didn't know, what nobody at Crestwood Military Academy knew, was that those hands had once held a dying radio operator in a jungle that didn't exist on any official map. And in exactly 43 hours, every general attending the Joint Chief ceremony would be standing at attention. They wouldn't be saluting the colonel. Vernon Thaddeus Calhoun rose slowly from his knees, brushing soil from his palms with movements so controlled they looked almost mechanical. He removed his canvas hat and held it against his chest, revealing close-cropped silver hair and a face weathered like old leather left too long in the sun. His pale blue eyes tracked the colonel's approach without seeming to move at all. "I asked you a question." Colonel Whitmore closed the distance with long theatrical strides, his immaculate uniform catching the early morning light. His brass gleamed. His creases could cut paper. Everything about him announced that he had spent more time preparing his appearance than preparing for anything else. "Did you hear me? Or are you deaf as well as incompetent?" "I heard you, sir." Vernon's voice came out soft, hoarse from years of disuse, carrying the faint lilt of Appalachian hollows. "I apologize for any disruption." Disruption? Whitmore stopped 3 feet away, close enough that Vernon could smell the expensive cologne masking the scent of ambition. "The Joint Chiefs of Staff arrive tomorrow. The Secretary of Defense, 4-star generals, and I find my groundskeeper crawling in the dirt like some kind of vagrant at 6 in the morning. I was tending the trees, sir. At this hour? They need water before the heat comes." Now, if you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, we'd love to know where you're joining us from. Drop a comment below telling us your location. And if stories about courage, sacrifice, and hidden heroes speak to you, consider subscribing to this channel. Your support helps us share more incredible true stories that honor the forgotten warriors among us. Now, let's continue. Whitmore's eyes swept over Vernon with undisguised contempt, cataloging every offense. The worn boots held together with stitching that looked hand-done, the shirt with frayed cuffs, the slight limp in his left leg as he shifted his weight, the dirt permanently embedded under fingernails that would never come fully clean. "Look at yourself." Whitmore's voice rose, carrying across the parade ground where cadets had paused in their morning run to watch. "This is the image of Crestwood Military Academy? This is what visiting dignitaries will see? I stay out of sight during ceremonies, sir." Vernon's response remained level, almost gentle. "I know my place." "Your place?" Whitmore laughed, a sharp sound without warmth. "Your place is apparently making this institution look like we employ homeless people off the street. When was the last time you even looked in a mirror?" Behind Whitmore, a barrel-chested man with a shaved head and the insignia of a command sergeant major had stopped walking. His eyes fixed on Vernon with an expression that shifted from casual observation to something far more focused, something that looked almost like recognition. Vernon noticed him, said nothing. "I want you invisible during the ceremony." Whitmore continued his tirade, voice growing louder to ensure the gathering audience could hear every word. "In fact, I want you confined to your cottage from noon today until the ceremony concludes. Can you manage that? Or do I need to draw you a picture?" "Yes, sir." Vernon's voice didn't waver. "And those trees?" Whitmore gestured toward the garden behind Vernon, 11 oaks arranged in a circle around a stone bench. "What is this, some kind of personal project?" "This isn't a memorial garden on the official grounds map. I planted them, sir." "You planted them? Without authorization?" 23 years ago, sir, when I first started here." Whitmore's eyes narrowed. 23 years of unauthorized landscaping. "I'll be reviewing your employment file. I'll be reviewing a lot of things." The command sergeant major took a step forward, something dangerous flickering in his expression. "Sir, if I might." "Not now, Sergeant Major." Whitmore didn't even turn around. "I'm dealing with the help." The older man's jaw tightened, but he held his position. His eyes never left Vernon's forearm, where the rolled sleeve had ridden up slightly to reveal the edge of faded ink beneath sun-damaged skin. Coordinates. A date. Something else. Vernon noticed the attention, pulled his sleeve down with the unconscious speed of a man who had spent decades hiding. "Is there anything else, sir?" Vernon asked, his voice still soft. "I have morning watering to complete." Whitmore stepped closer, close enough to violate the space of any man who still had pride left to wound. "Did I give you permission to speak?" "No, sir." "Then don't." Whitmore turned partially, performing for the audience of frozen cadets and gathering staff. This is what happens when institutions get soft, when we let sentimentality override standards. This man probably hasn't accomplished anything meaningful in his entire life. And here he is, playing gardener on grounds that host the future leaders of our military. Vernon's expression didn't change. His hands remained still at his sides. But something in his posture shifted almost imperceptibly, weight centering, shoulders settling into a position that spoke of training so deep it had become instinct. The command sergeant major saw it. His breath caught. "I want you gone by 1800 hours today." Whitmore delivered the ultimatum with obvious satisfaction. "Pack your things. Vacate that cottage. If I see you anywhere near the parade ground tomorrow, I'll have security escort you off the property in front of every general attending." Vernon was quiet for a long moment. Then, barely above a whisper, "Yes, sir. I'll stay with my trees." Whitmore blinked. "Your trees?" "My trees, sir." Vernon's pale eyes met the colonel's directly for the first time, and something ancient moved behind them. Something that had seen darkness Whitmore couldn't imagine. "I planted every one of them, and I'll tend them until I can't anymore." He turned and walked back toward the garden, his limp more pronounced now, but his spine straight as a rifle barrel. The command sergeant major watched him go. His father's voice echoed in his memory, words spoken 100 times over a childhood filled with stories of the secret war. "Spectre carried me 3 miles. Never set me down. Never stopped moving." But what Colonel Whitmore didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that in exactly 43 hours, every general at that ceremony would be standing at attention. And they wouldn't be saluting the colonel. They would be saluting a ghost who had refused to stay dead, and the trees he had planted for the brothers who couldn't come home. The memorial garden held the silence of a cathedral at dawn. Vernon moved between the trees with the careful reverence of a priest performing communion, his watering contrailing silver ribbons across roots he had nursed for more than 2 decades. 11 oaks stood in their perfect circle, branches reaching toward each other like old friends holding hands against the dark. He stopped at the oldest tree, the one he had planted first, his palm pressed flat against bark worn smooth by 23 years of daily contact. The wood felt warm beneath his fingers, alive in a way that made the boundary between living and dead seem less absolute than the world pretended. "Morning, Ezekiel." Vernon's voice came out barely above a breath. "Still here, brother. Still trying." The wind moved through the branches, and for a moment he could almost hear a reply, almost feel the weight of a young man's hand on his shoulder, the way it had rested there 1,000 times in another lifetime. Before the jungle, before the blood, before everything ended and, somehow, kept going anyway. He closed his eyes, and the smell of Virginia soil became something else. Humid air, thick enough to chew, rotting vegetation and cordite. The distant thump of helicopter rotors that might be salvation or might be too late. March of 1971. The coordinates burned into his forearm and deeper into his memory. 16.4667 degrees north. 107.583 degrees east. The place where the map stopped being official and the war stopped being acknowledged. 12 men crossed that border in the dark. Special Forces Operational Detachment, attached to Military Assistance Command Vietnam, Studies and Observations Group. MACSOG, the words that didn't exist in any press release, any congressional record, any history book that ordinary people would ever read. Vernon had been their team leader. Call sign Spectre, 26 years old and already ancient in the ways that mattered. The mission was supposed to be simple. Reconnaissance. Confirm the NVA supply route threading through the Laotian jungle. Photograph the positions. Get out clean. Nobody was supposed to die. Nobody was ever supposed to die. His hand tightened on the tree bark as the memory sharpened. Ezekiel Crow had been 19 years old, a radio operator from the same Appalachian Hollow, where Vernon had learned to shoot squirrels off fence posts before he learned to read. The kid had a voice made for calling in coordinates and a smile that could light up a firebase at midnight. He had also been the one who saw the ambush a half-second before it happened. The one who shouted the warning that saved 3 lives before the jungle erupted in fire. Vernon's jaw clenched. The morning air felt suddenly colder. The NVA battalion had materialized from the green like ghosts, 100 guns where there should have been a dozen. The reconnaissance mission became a 14-hour firefight in terrain that swallowed sound and sense and hope. Vernon had moved through that jungle like smoke, his rifle speaking in controlled bursts while his mind calculated angles and trajectories faster than conscious thought could follow. He had carried wounded men on his shoulders. He had gone back into the kill zone twice when sanity screamed at him to run. He had done everything right, everything except save them. The RPG had come from a window they had cleared twice, a position they had verified as empty. Vernon had been 3 feet from Ezekiel when the round struck, close enough to feel the heat, close enough to be showered in blood that wasn't his own. The kid had lived for 90 seconds, long enough to push the radio into Vernon's hands, long enough to say the words that had echoed through 3 decades of sleepless nights. Finish the call, brother. Get them home. Vernon had finished the call. His voice hadn't wavered as he recited extraction coordinates with his best friend's blood soaking through his fatigues. The helicopter had come. 4 men had climbed aboard. 7 bodies had been left behind for retrieval the next night, when another team went back into the darkness to carry out what remained. Vernon's eyes opened. The Virginia morning reasserted itself around him, soft and green and impossibly peaceful. A cardinal sang from somewhere nearby, oblivious to the weight of memory pressing down on the man beneath the trees. He pulled the leather pouch from his pocket, 11 small bags inside, each containing a pinch of soil, earth from the places where his brothers had fallen, carried across an ocean in 3 decades, waiting for a proper resting place. This garden was that place, each tree planted on the anniversary of a death, each one watered with grief that had no other outlet. The sound of footsteps made him turn. A young woman in cadet uniform approached along the garden path, tablet computer clutched against her chest. Cadet First Class Miranda Okonkwo. She had interviewed him twice before for some kind of school paper, asking questions about the garden's history that he had deflected with the skill of long practice. Mr. Cal. Her voice carried the careful respect of someone approaching a subject they didn't fully understand. I'm sorry to bother you so early. I saw what happened with the colonel. Vernon slipped the leather pouch back into his pocket. Nothing happened, Mississippi. Just a misunderstanding. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes moving across the trees with visible curiosity. I've been doing research for my thesis about MACVSOG. Vernon's hand stilled on the watering can. The Studies and Observations Group, she continued. The secret war in Laos and Cambodia. The men who ran missions that officially never happened. Old history. Vernon's voice came out rougher than intended. Old men and old wars. The trees, Mr. Cal. She gestured at the oaks surrounding them. 11 of them, planted over 23 years, each one on a different date. I checked the records. Vernon said nothing. His fingers found the bark of Ezekiel's tree again, steadying himself against something that felt like drowning. The dates correspond to casualties. She spoke softly now, almost gently, from a specific operation. March 1971. Laos border. The garden seemed to contract around him, the trees pressing closer, the sky pressing down. 30 years of silence, balanced on a razor's edge. I found a photograph. Her voice barely carried. Declassified last year. 12 men in tiger-striped camouflage. Faces painted for night operations. She held up her tablet, and Vernon saw ghosts looking back at him. Young faces. Alive faces. Ezekiel grinning in the front row. Radio strapped to his back like it was part of his body. Vernon's expression didn't change. Couldn't change. 30 years of discipline held him together when everything inside wanted to shatter. The trees remember what people forget, he said quietly. That's all that matters. He turned away, back to his watering, back to his ritual. Behind him, he heard her footsteps hesitate. Mr. Cal. Her voice followed him like an echo. Can I ask you something? But Vernon was already walking deeper into the garden, away from questions he had spent 3 decades learning not to answer. Away from the photograph of 12 young men who had believed they were invincible. Away from everything except the trees and the names and the weight of survival that never got lighter. Okonkwo watched him go, her eyes dropping to his forearm where the rolled sleeve had shifted. A glimpse of faded ink. Numbers. A symbol she had seen before in classified documents and memorial walls. She didn't follow, but she also didn't leave. And in the shadows at the edge of the garden, Command Sergeant Major Lucius Barnwell stood watching, his father's voice echoing in his memory. Spectre. They called him Spectre. He moved through that jungle like smoke. By noon, the parade ground had transformed into a staging area for ambition. Workers erected a viewing platform draped in red, white, and blue bunting. Sound technicians tested microphones that would carry speeches to an audience of generals and politicians. Everywhere Colonel Whitmore walked, people moved faster, spoke louder, performed harder. Vernon watched from the edge of the memorial garden, his rake idle in his hands. 23 years he had observed ceremonies from this distance. Graduations, promotions, retirements. The rituals of an institution that had no idea what grew in the soil at its margins. The colonel's voice carried across the manicured grass, sharp as breaking glass. I want those chairs realigned. They're off by 3 inches. 3 inches. Do you understand what kind of impression that makes? A junior officer scrambled to comply, face flushed with the particular shame of public correction. Around him, other staff members worked with the brittle efficiency of people waiting for their turn to be humiliated. Whitmore surveyed his domain with the satisfaction of a man who confused fear with respect. His eyes swept the grounds, cataloging imperfections real and imagined, until they landed on Vernon's distant figure. The groundskeeper felt the attention like crosshairs settling on his back. He didn't turn, didn't react. Just continued raking leaves that didn't need raking, performing invisibility the way he had performed it for 3 decades. Whitmore's voice rose, aimed like a weapon. Sergeant Major Barnwell, is that groundskeeper still on the property? Barnwell materialized from somewhere behind the viewing platform, his expression carefully neutral. Mr. Calhoun is tending the East Garden, sir. As he does every day. I gave him until 1800 hours to vacate. You gave him until 1800 hours to be invisible during the ceremony, sir. Barnwell's tone carried the precise calibration of a man correcting a superior without appearing to correct anyone. The ceremony doesn't begin until tomorrow. Whitmore's jaw tightened. Are you arguing with me, Sergeant Major? No, sir. Clarifying. For a moment, something dangerous flickered between them. Then Whitmore turned away, finding a new target for his dissatisfaction. The bunting. The bunting is crooked. Someone fix the bunting. Barnwell didn't move immediately. His eyes found Vernon across the distance, and something passed between them that required no words. A recognition, an acknowledgement, the silent communication of men who understood things that uniforms and rank could never convey. Then he turned and walked toward the memorial garden. Vernon heard him coming, but didn't look up from his rake. The leaves whispered against grass as he gathered them into neat piles that would be scattered again by the afternoon wind. Mr. Calhoun. Barnwell stopped at the garden's edge, hands clasped behind his back. May I enter? Vernon paused, looked up, studied the younger man's face with eyes that had learned to read intentions in the darkest jungles on earth. It's not my garden to permit, Sergeant Major. I just tend it. Barnwell stepped through the gap in the hedge and stopped again, taking in the 11 trees, the stone bench at the center, the small bronze plaque he had never noticed before. His lips moved as he counted. 11. Vernon resumed raking. The silence stretched between them, comfortable in the way that silence between certain men can be. My father passed 3 years ago. Barnwell's voice came out rough. Cancer. He had time to talk at the end. Time to tell stories he'd kept quiet for 40 years. I'm sorry for your loss. He talked about Vietnam. Barnwell moved deeper into the garden, his fingers brushing the bark of the nearest oak. About the secret war, the missions that never happened, the men who came back different, and the men who didn't come back at all. Vernon's rake stilled. He talked about being 17 years old and scared out of his mind in jungle, soaked thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Barnwell's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. He talked about an ambush, about taking a round through his shoulder and another through his leg, about lying in the mud, waiting to die. Lots of men have stories like that. Vernon's response came out flat, practiced, a wall built from decades of deflection. Not like his. Barnwell turned to face him. He said his team leader picked him up, carried him 3 miles through enemy territory with the whole jungle trying to kill them both. He said the man never stopped, never set him down, never even slowed. Vernon's hands tightened on the rake handle. The wood creaked softly. He said the man had a call sign. Barnwell took a step closer, said it was whispered in special operations like a prayer. Said the man was a ghost. Said he moved through that jungle like smoke. Said he should have died 20 times, but kept coming back for his men. Your father was a brave man. Vernon's voice had gone very quiet. To survive what he survived because someone carried him. Barnwell's eyes dropped to Vernon's forearm, to the edge of ink visible beneath the rolled sleeve. Because someone refused to leave it behind. The afternoon light shifted through the oak branches, dappling the ground with shadows that moved like memories. Somewhere across the parade ground, Colonel Whitmore's voice rose again in complaint about some new imperfection. Your father. Vernon spoke without looking up. What was his name? Corporal Leonard Barnwell. Barnwell's voice cracked on the rank. He made a home, got married, had me, lived to see his grandchildren, all because of one night in Laos when someone carried him through hell. Vernon closed his eyes. His lips moved silently, and Barnwell could almost swear he was reciting names. A litany, a prayer. I remember Leonard. The words came out like stones dropping into still water. He was 17 years old, took a round through his shoulder and another through his thigh. Kept trying to tell me to leave him, kept saying he wasn't worth it. Barnwell's breath caught. The space between them seemed to contract. I told him every man was worth it. Vernon opened his eyes, and for a moment the groundskeeper mask slipped. Something older and harder looked out from behind those pale blue eyes. Something that had seen the worst of what humans could do to each other and kept going anyway. Every single man. The silence that followed felt sacred, heavy, full of ghosts. Then Colonel Whitmore's voice shattered it, carrying across the grounds like artillery. Sergeant Major Barnwell, I need you at the viewing platform. Now. Barnwell didn't move immediately. His eyes held Vernon's, and decades of unspoken history passed between them. Lieutenant General Stone arrives tomorrow afternoon. Barnwell spoke quickly, quietly. He commands SOCOM, and he knew your team. Vernon's expression didn't change. Hill recognized that tattoo from across the parade ground. Barnwell glanced toward the sound of the colonel's increasingly impatient calls. Then you won't be able to hide anymore. Vernon's hand found the nearest tree, Ezekiel's tree, his fingers pressed against the bark like a man touching a gravestone. I'm not the one who needs remembering, Sergeant Major. Vernon's voice came out soft but steady. They are. Sergeant Major Barnwell. Whitmore's tone had escalated to fury. Now, Barnwell held Vernon's gaze for one more moment. Then he turned and walked back toward the parade ground, toward the colonel and the ceremony, and the world that had no idea what grew in the garden at its margins. But he looked back once, and what he saw made his throat tighten. Vernon standing among his trees, one hand on the oldest oak, his lips moving in silent conversation with men who had been dead for 30 years. And the afternoon light catching the edge of a tattoo that told a story no one was supposed to remember. The cottage sat at the edge of the academy grounds like an afterthought, a small stone structure that predated most of the buildings on campus by half a century. Vernon had lived there for 23 years, and in all that time he had never once called it home. Home was a hollow in the Appalachian Mountains where his mother had taught him to read from a Bible with a cracked leather cover. Home was a fire base in the Central Highlands where 12 men had become brothers in the way that only shared danger can forge. Home was a circle of trees where the dead kept him company and the living left him alone. This cottage was just where he waited to join them. He stood now in the single room that served as bedroom, kitchen, and living space, his hand resting on the worn surface of a footlocker he had carried across 3 decades and 2 continents. The metal was dented in places, scratched in others, marked by the kind of wear that only comes from constant movement and uncertain shelter. Inside lay the artifacts of a life that officially never existed. Vernon lifted the lid slowly, the hinges protesting with a sound like old bones settling. The smell that rose to meet him was memory itself. Canvas and gun oil, mothballs and jungle rot. The particular mustiness of things kept too long in darkness. On top lay a photograph in a simple wooden frame. 12 faces looked back at him, young and invincible and utterly unaware of what waited in the green maze beyond the camera's edge. Tiger-striped camouflage and face paint couldn't hide their grins. They had been boys playing at war, certain that skill and brotherhood would be enough to bring them all home. Vernon touched the glass, his finger tracing the outline of Ezekiel Crow's smile. The kid had been standing right next to him when the photograph was taken, close enough that their shoulders touched. Close enough that Vernon could hear him humming some song about a girl back home whose letters he read so many times the paper had gone soft as cloth. I should have seen the shooter. Vernon's voice came out barely above a whisper. I should have cleared that window one more time. The memory unfolded whether he wanted it to or not. The jungle had been quiet in the way that jungles are never quiet unless something is terribly wrong. Vernon had felt it in his bones before his mind caught up. That animal awareness that every SOG operator developed or died. He had raised his fist to signal halt, but the world had already begun to tear itself apart. Muzzle flashes from every direction. The crack of AK-47 rounds snapping past his ears. Ezekiel's voice cutting through the chaos, calling in their position, begging for extraction that might never come. They had fought for 14 hours. 14 hours of ammunition running low and men running out. 14 hours of Vernon moving through the kill zone like something not quite human, dragging wounded men to cover, going back for the ones who couldn't move on their own. Leonard Barnwell had taken rounds through his shoulder and thigh in the 3rd hour. Vernon had carried him half a mile to a depression in the earth that offered minimal cover, then gone back for Eddie Chun, whose leg had been shattered by shrapnel. By hour 10, only 5 of them could still fight. By hour 12, the ammunition was nearly gone. By hour 14, the helicopter finally came, rotors beating the air like the wings of salvation itself. The RPG hit Ezekiel 30 seconds before extraction. Vernon's hand trembled against the photograph. The glass was cold beneath his fingers, the faces behind it frozen in a moment before everything ended. He reached deeper into the footlocker, past folded maps and faded orders, past a purple heart he had never worn and a silver star he had never acknowledged. His fingers found the leather pouch and drew it out. 11 small bags. 11 pinches of earth. The only graves his brothers would ever have. He had gone back for the soil himself. Years later, when the war was over and the records were sealed and the world had moved on to newer horrors. 3 separate trips to Southeast Asia, each one unofficial, each one funded by savings he had accumulated by wanting nothing and needing less. He had stood in the places where they died and gathered the earth into his hands. He had spoken their names aloud in jungles that had swallowed their blood and grown green again over their memory. And then he had come to Virginia, to a military academy that trained the next generation, and he had planted trees. Vernon set the pouch on the small table beside his cot. Next to it, he placed a photograph. Next to that, A Bible with names written inside the front cover in handwriting that had grown shakier with each passing year. The dog tags came last. 2 sets. His own, worn smooth by decades against his skin, and Ezekiel's, still stained with something dark in the grooves of the stamped letters. He had taken them from around the kid's neck in the helicopter, had held them while the medic pronounced what Vernon already knew, had carried them ever since, the weight of them a reminder that he had failed the one person who trusted him most. Finish the call, brother. Get them home. Vernon closed his eyes. The cottage felt smaller than usual, the walls pressing in like the walls of memory itself. He had gotten 4 of them home alive. He had gone back for 7 bodies. He had spent 30 years tending their memory in a garden that no one understood. And now a colonel with more ambition than sense was trying to take that away from him. Vernon opened his eyes. Something had shifted in his expression, a hardness settling into the weathered lines of his face. For 23 years he had accepted every indignity, absorbed every slight, let the world believe he was nothing more than an old man with dirt under his fingernails and nowhere else to go. But the trees were his. The names were his. The memory was his. He picked up Ezekiel's dog tags and held them against his chest. The metal was warm from his touch, alive in a way that defied logic and time. I'm not leaving, brother. Vernon's voice came out steady now, the hoarseness burned away by something older and stronger. I'm done running, done hiding. Whatever happens tomorrow, I'll be standing in that garden. He looked at the photograph one more time. 12 faces, 12 brothers, 11 trees planted in Virginia soil, and one old man who had finally decided that some things were worth fighting for, even if the only weapon he had left was the truth. Dusk settled over Crestwood Military Academy like a hell breath. The parade ground stood empty now, the viewing platform complete, the chairs aligned with geometric precision that would satisfy even Colonel Whitmore's exacting standards. Tomorrow the grounds would fill with brass and ceremony. Tonight they held only shadows and the whisper of wind through oak leaves. Vernon knelt at the base of the youngest tree, his hands working compost into the soil with the tenderness of a father tucking a child into bed. This oak had been planted just 3 years ago, on the anniversary of Marcus Tolley's death. Marcus had been the last of the 11 to fall, not in the jungle, but in a VA hospital in Oklahoma, his body finally surrendering to the Agent Orange that had been eating him alive for decades. Vernon had driven 18 hours to be there at the end, had held Marcus's hand while the monitors flatlined, had gathered a pinch of Oklahoma earth from outside the hospital window and added it to his leather pouch. The war never stopped killing them. It just learned patience. Footsteps approached from the direction of the main campus. Vernon recognized the rhythm without looking up. Too light for Barnwell. Too hesitant for Whitmore. Mr. Cal, Cadet Okonkwo's voice carried uncertainty that hadn't been there during their earlier encounters. May I speak with you? Vernon continued working the soil. Free country. Mississippi speak if you like. She moved closer, stopping at the edge of the tree's shadow. In her hands, she held the tablet computer, its screen dark, but somehow heavy with information waiting to be revealed. I've been researching all day. Her words came out in a rush, tumbling over each other like water over stones. After what I saw this morning, after the photograph, after watching the way you move, the way I move, like a soldier, she took another step forward. Like someone who spent years learning to move through spaces where standing still meant dying. Vernon's hands stilled in the soil. The evening air felt suddenly colder. I found more photographs. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Declassified files. After-action reports with so many redactions they look like zebra stripes. But some things couldn't be hidden. Old history. Vernon's response came automatically, the deflection worn smooth by decades of use. There was a team. Okonkwo pressed forward as if she hadn't heard him. Special Forces Operational Detachment. Attached to something called MACSOG. They ran a mission into Laos in March of 1971. Vernon closed his eyes. 12 men went in. Her voice trembled now. Only 4 came out alive. 7 bodies were recovered the following night. The team leader was listed as MIA, presumed Kia, but his body was never found. Lots of men were never found. The after-action reports describe what the team leader did. Okonkwo moved around to face him, her eyes bright with something between revelation and reverence. He carried wounded men through 3 miles of jungle. He went back into the kill zone twice. He held a position for 14 hours against an entire NVA battalion. He called in the extraction coordinates while holding his dying radio operator. The trees seemed to press closer in the fading light. Ezekiel's branches reached toward Vernon like arms offering embrace or absolution. The team leader received the Silver Star. Okonkwo's voice had gone very quiet. He was recommended for the Medal of Honor, but the file was classified so deeply it never processed. He was supposed to be dead. Everyone thought he was dead. Some men are better off dead. Vernon's voice came out rough as gravel. Some men don't deserve to keep breathing when their brothers are in the ground. Okonkwo flinched at the words, but she didn't retreat. Instead, she knelt in the grass across from him, bringing herself to his level, meeting his pale eyes with a directness that reminded him of young soldiers he had trained a lifetime ago. The team leader's call sign was Spectre. She spoke the word like a prayer. The after-action reports say he moved through the jungle like smoke. Say the enemy couldn't track him. Say he appeared and disappeared like a ghost. Vernon said nothing. His hands remained frozen in the soil, fingers curled around earth that had once been a continent away. There's a memorial wall at Fort Bragg. Okonkwo continued, relentless now. 11 names from that operation. 11 men who died so others could come home. But there's no name for the team leader. Because officially he doesn't exist. Because officially he died in a jungle that officially was never a battlefield. The silence stretched between them, filled with cricket song and the distant hum of the Academy's emergency generators. Then Vernon spoke, and his voice carried a weariness that 30 years of survival had carved into his bones. "What do you want from me, Miss Okonkwo? I want to understand." Her response came immediately. "I've spent 6 months studying ghosts. Men who ran missions that never happened. Men who died in places that don't exist on any map. I thought I was writing about history." She reached out, her fingers hovering just above his forearm, where the sleeve had ridden up to reveal the edge of faded ink. "I didn't know I was writing about you." Vernon looked down at her hand, at the tattoo she wasn't quite touching, at the coordinates that marked the place where 11 of his brothers had bled into foreign soil. "You should go inside." His voice came out softer now. "Big day tomorrow. Important people coming. Mr. Cal, the ceremony isn't about an old groundskeeper." Vernon pushed himself to his feet, his left hip protesting with familiar pain. "It's about the future. These young men and women you're training with. They're what matters now." Okonkwo rose with him, her tablet clutched against her chest like armor. "But you matter too. What you did matters." Vernon's hand found the bark of Ezekiel's tree, steadying himself against the weight of decades. "What I did was survive." His voice carried the hollow echo of a man who had never forgiven himself for that particular sin. "They're the ones who mattered. They're the ones who deserve to be remembered." He turned away, moving deeper into the garden, away from her questions and her research and the truth she had uncovered. But her voice followed him like an echo that refused to fade. "Lieutenant General Stone arrives tomorrow." She called after him. "He commands special operations. He's giving the keynote address." Vernon's steps faltered for just a moment. "He knew your team, Mr. Cal. He trained with some of them before they deployed. And when he sees that tattoo, when he hears your name, everything changes." Vernon stopped at the center of the garden, surrounded by 11 trees that had grown from grief and guilt and love that outlasted death. "Maybe it's time." Her voice was barely a whisper now. "Maybe it's time to stop being a ghost." The evening light faded to purple around them. Somewhere on the parade ground, a worker tested the microphone system, and feedback whined across the empty chairs like a mechanical scream. Vernon stood among his trees and said nothing, but his hand trembled against the bark of the oldest oak. And for the first time in 30 years, the ghost wondered if he was ready to be seen. Morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that Virginia reserves for days of consequence. The sky stretched overhead in unbroken blue, and the autumn air carried just enough chill to make dress uniforms feel appropriate rather than oppressive. By 900 hours, the first vehicles had begun arriving at Crestwood Military Academy's main gate. Colonel Whitmore stood at the entrance to the parade ground, his uniform pressed to perfection, his smile calibrated to convey exactly the right mixture of confidence and deference. Behind him, ranks of cadets stood at parade rest, their young faces carefully blank, their posture reflecting years of training designed to transform children into soldiers. Vernon watched from the memorial garden, hidden in the shadow of Ezekiel's oak. He had not slept, had spent the night sitting on the stone bench at the center of his trees, speaking to brothers who could no longer answer. Now he waited. For what? He wasn't entirely certain. The convoy of black SUVs wound through the Academy's main drive with the practice choreography of a military operation. Security personnel emerged first, fanning out across the grounds with the particular alertness of people paid to notice everything. Then came the officers, emerging from vehicles in ascending order of rank, their chests heavy with ribbons and medals that told stories of careers spent in service. Lieutenant General Raymond Stone was the last to emerge. Vernon's breath caught in his chest. Even from this distance, he recognized the way the man carried himself. Stone had put on weight since Vietnam, and his hair had gone silver, but the fundamental architecture of his bearing remained unchanged. He moved like someone who had once been young and fast and lethal, the muscle memory of a warrior lingering beneath the polish of a general. They had never served together directly, but Vernon knew his face from intelligence briefings, from the overlapping circles of special operations that created connections between men who had never officially met. Stone had trained with Eddie Chun and Marcus Tolley before their deployment, had written letters to their families after they died, had spent 30 years believing Vernon was among the dead. Colonel Whitmore approached the general with the particular eagerness of a man who saw career advancement in every handshake. "Sir, it's an honor. Crestwood is privileged to host you." Stone's response was cordial but distracted. His eyes moved across the grounds, cataloging details, assessing the space with the instinctive vigilance that never fully faded from men who had lived in places where inattention meant death. Vernon pressed himself deeper into the oak's shadow. His heart hammered against his ribs with a rhythm he hadn't felt since the jungle, since the firefight, since the helicopter had finally appeared against a sky the color of bruised fruit. The general's gaze swept toward the memorial garden, pausing on the circle of trees visible through the gap in the hedge. His brow furrowed slightly, a question forming that he didn't yet know how to ask. Then Whitmore was speaking again, guiding him toward the viewing platform, drawing his attention back to the ceremony that would occupy the next several hours. Vernon exhaled slowly. His hands were trembling. He pressed them flat against the bark of Ezekiel's tree, drawing strength from the solid presence of wood that had grown from grief. "You'd laugh at me, brother." Vernon's whisper barely stirred the air. "Hiding from a general like I'm 19 years old and scared of my first sergeant." The morning progressed with the mechanical precision of military ceremony. Speeches were delivered. Honors were presented. Cadets marched with the synchronized perfection that represented years of discipline hammered into young bodies. Vernon remained in the garden, unable to leave, unwilling to be seen. He watered trees that didn't need watering. He pulled weeds that had already been pulled. He performed the rituals of groundskeeping with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. By noon, the formal program had concluded, and the dignitaries had retired to the officers' club for a reception that would consume the afternoon. The parade ground emptied except for workers dismantling the viewing platform and cadets released to their barracks. Vernon finally allowed himself to move toward the cottage. He needed water, food, a moment to breathe without the weight of revelation pressing against his chest. He didn't see Colonel Whitmore until it was too late to retreat. The colonel emerged from behind the groundskeeping shed, his face flushed with a fury that had been building since the previous morning. His perfectly pressed uniform had begun to wilt in the afternoon warmth, and his carefully maintained composure had cracked along fault lines of wounded pride. "You." Whitmore's voice came out in a hiss. "I told you to stay out of sight." Vernon stopped, drew himself up slowly. "I've been in the garden, sir. Haven't set foot on the parade ground." "The garden." Whitmore moved closer, invading Vernon's space with the particular aggression of a man who had spent all morning performing deference and needed someone to dominate. "Your precious garden. Your unauthorized trees. Your pathetic little project." "Sir, I've been making inquiries." Whitmore's eyes narrowed. 23 years of employment records, and somehow nobody can tell me how you got hired. No background check. No differences. Just a groundskeeper who appeared one day and never left. Vernon said nothing. His hands remained still at his sides, but something in his posture had begun to shift. The groundskeeper mask was slipping, and behind it something older and harder was starting to surface. "You're going to tell me who you really are." Whitmore reached out and grabbed Vernon's arm, fingers closing around the forearm with the particular cruelty of a man exercising power he had done nothing to earn. "You're going to tell me what you're hiding." His grip tightened. The sleeve rode up, and then Colonel Bradley Whitmore III saw the tattoo. Coordinates etched in faded ink. A date that meant nothing to him. A skull and crossbones insignia that he had only seen in classified briefings. And 11 small tally marks arranged in a pattern that looked like hash marks on a prison wall. "What the hell is this?" Whitmore's voice had changed, uncertainty creeping into the edges of his manufactured authority. Vernon looked down at the hand gripping his arm, then up at the colonel's face. And when he spoke, his voice carried a cold precision that hadn't emerged in 30 years. "You're going to want to let go of me, Colonel." Across the grounds, Command Sergeant Major Barnwell had stopped mid-stride, his eyes fixed on the confrontation unfolding near the groundskeeping shed. And behind him, walking slowly from the officers' club with a drink in his hand and curiosity in his expression, Lieutenant General Raymond Stone had begun moving toward the memorial garden, toward the old groundskeeper with the faded tattoo, toward a ghost he had believed dead for 3 decades. Vernon's warning hung in the air between them, cold and precise as a rifle shot. Whitmore's grip loosened reflexively, but he didn't release. Pride wouldn't allow it, not when subordinates might be watching, not when his authority was being challenged by a man with dirt under his fingernails. "I asked you a question." Whitmore forced steel into his voice, overcompensating for the uncertainty crawling up his spine. "What is that tattoo? Where did you get it?" Vernon looked at the hand on his arm, then at the colonel's face. Something ancient moved behind his pale eyes, the accumulated weight of 30 years of silence pressing against a door that had never been tested. He could walk away. He had walked away 1,000 times before. From VA offices that lost his paperwork. From fellow veterans who recognized something in his bearing. From every opportunity to reclaim a name that had been declared dead in an official file. But behind him stood 11 trees. 11 names. 11 brothers who had trusted him to bring them home. And he was tired of running. "You want to know what this tattoo means, Colonel?" Vernon's voice came out soft, but it carried. 16.4667 degrees north. 107.583 degrees east. Whitmore blinked. "Coordinates?" "A Shao Valley." Vernon continued as if he hadn't heard. "Laotian border. March 11th, 1971. His free hand came up slowly, pointing at each tally mark in turn. "Ezekiel Crow, radio operator, 19 years old. Leonard Barnwell, point man, 17. Eddie Chun, medic, 22. Marcus Tolley, heavy weapons, 24. His voice never wavered as he recited the names, speaking them aloud in the open air for the first time since he had carved them into his forearm in a field hospital 30 years ago. Thomas Redhawk, James Whitfield, Samuel Patterson, Frederick Okonkwo, David Greenwood, Michael Santos, Robert Kingsley. Whitmore's face had gone pale. His hand fell away from Vernon's arm, as if the touch had become electric. 11 men. Vernon's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. 11 brothers. They went into that jungle with me, and they didn't come out. The afternoon air seemed to crystallize around them, Somewhere in the distance, a cadet shouted a cadence call. A bird sang from the memorial garden. The ordinary sounds of the academy continued, indifferent to the extraordinary moment unfolding near the groundskeeping shed. That's not possible. Whitmore's voice cracked on the words. You can't be. Those files are classified. Those operations never happened. Vernon rolled his sleeve down slowly, covering the tattoo with the practiced motion of a man who had been hiding for decades. You're right, Colonel. His voice carried no anger, no triumph, only the bone-deep exhaustion of a man who had carried weight that should have killed him. Those operations never happened. Those men never died. And I was never there. He turned toward the memorial garden, toward the 11 oaks that had grown from grief and guilt and love. But the trees remember, even when the files are sealed, even when the world forgets. The trees remember. Whitmore stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing without sound. The man he had dismissed as a vagrant, had mocked as incompetent, had threatened with arrest and removal, was walking away from him with the quiet dignity of a soldier who had nothing left to prove. Wait. The word came out strangled. Just wait. Vernon stopped, but didn't turn. Who are you? Whitmore's voice had lost its commanding edge. What was your rank? What was your call sign? Before Vernon could answer, another voice cut across the grounds. A voice that carried the unmistakable authority of stars on a collar. Spectre. Vernon's spine went rigid. The single word hit him like a bullet, freezing him in place. Lieutenant General Raymond Stone stood 20 feet away, his dress uniform immaculate, his face the color of chalk. Behind him, Command Sergeant Major Barnwell had stopped mid-stride, and a cluster of junior officers had gathered at a respectful distance, sensing that something significant was unfolding. Stone took a step forward. His eyes were fixed on Vernon's back, on the posture that had suddenly shifted from groundskeeper to something else entirely. Turn around. Stone's voice came out rough. Let me see your face. Vernon closed his eyes. 30 years of hiding. 30 years of anonymity. 30 years of penance served in silence. And now, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, it was ending. He turned slowly, his shoulders squared, his chin lifted. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable, the mask of the groundskeeper falling away to reveal the soldier who had never truly disappeared. Stone made a sound that was half gasp, half prayer. His hand came up to cover his mouth, and his eyes filled with something that looked terrifyingly like tears. We thought you were dead. The general's voice broke on the words. We looked for you. For years. When you stopped cashing your pension checks, stopped responding to VA correspondence, we thought you had finally. Vernon shook his head slowly. I couldn't take the money, sir. Felt wrong. They're buried over there with nothing. And I'm supposed to collect a pension? Stone's gaze moved to the memorial garden, to the circle of oaks visible through the gap in the hedge. 11 trees. Perfectly spaced. Perfectly tended. You built them a memorial. Stone's voice was barely audible. You've been here the whole time, tending their graves. Vernon's hand found the bark of the nearest tree. Ezekiel's tree. Every morning, sir. For 23 years. Every morning, I tell them I'm still here. Still trying. The silence that followed was the kind that changes everything. The kind that separates before from after. Colonel Whitmore stood forgotten, his career concerns suddenly trivial against the magnitude of what he was witnessing. Barnwell had removed his beret, holding it against his chest. The junior officers had gone still as statues. And Lieutenant General Raymond Stone, commander of Army Special Operations, walked slowly toward the old groundskeeper who had carried his friends through hell and then spent 3 decades carrying their memory. We trained together. Stone's voice trembled. Eddie and Marcus and me. Before they deployed. Before you took them into Laos. Vernon nodded. I know, sir. I was supposed to be on that team. I got reassigned 3 days before the mission. The words landed like stones in still water. I've spent 30 years wondering why I got to live, and they didn't. Stone stopped an arm's length away. And now I find out you've been wondering the same thing. Vernon's eyes glistened. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. Every single day, sir. Every single day. Stone reached out and placed his hand on Vernon's shoulder. The touch was gentle, Reverend, it's time to stop hiding, Spectre. His voice carried the quiet authority of a man who understood. It's time to let us bring you home. The weight of Stone's hand on Vernon's shoulder felt like an anchor and a lifeline at once. For 30 years, he had avoided human touch, flinching from handshakes and sidestepping the casual contact that ordinary people exchanged without thought. Touch meant connection. Connection meant vulnerability. And vulnerability meant facing the truth he had spent 3 decades burying. Now that truth stood exposed in the afternoon light, witnessed by a general and a colonel and a gathering crowd of officers who sensed that history was unfolding before them. Sir, Vernon's voice came out rough. I appreciate what you're offering, but I'm not the one who needs honoring. They are. He gestured toward the memorial garden, toward the 11 oaks standing sentinel over soil that held no bodies but carried more weight than any cemetery. Stone followed his gaze. His jaw tightened with emotion he didn't try to hide. Tell me about the garden. The general's voice had dropped to something almost intimate. Tell me about the trees. Vernon hesitated. The words he had spoken only to the dead pressed against his throat, demanding release. I planted the first one in 1982, 11 years after the operation, on the anniversary of Ezekiel's death. Stone nodded slowly. Your radio operator. I read the after-action reports. He took an RPG blast, calling an extraction. He took the blast meant for me. Vernon's correction carried no self-pity, only the flat recitation of fact. I was 3 feet away, close enough to feel the heat, close enough to catch him when he fell. The crowd had grown. Word was spreading through the academy with the particular velocity of extraordinary news. Cadets and officers and staff drifted toward the memorial garden, drawn by some instinct for moments that mattered. Vernon saw none of them. His eyes remained fixed on the oldest oak, on Ezekiel's tree. He lived for 90 seconds. Vernon continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a story told only to the dark. Long enough to push the radio into my hands. Long enough to tell me to finish the call, to get the others home. And you did. Stone's words were not a question. 4 of us made it to the extraction point. Vernon's hand found the leather pouch in his pocket, fingers closing around the 11 small bags of soil. 7 bodies were left behind. I went back the next night with another team. Carried them out myself. The silence that followed was broken only by the rustle of oak leaves in the afternoon breeze. I couldn't save them, sir. Vernon's voice cracked for the first time, the mask of 30 years developing fissures that spread like lightning through glass. I couldn't keep them alive, but I could keep them remembered. So I came here, planted trees, tended them every morning for 23 years. He pulled the leather pouch from his pocket and opened it with trembling fingers. 11 small bags, 11 pinches of earth. I went back for this. Vernon held up the pouch. 3 separate trips. Gathered soil from the places where they fell. Mixed it into the earth around each tree. Stone's breath caught audibly. Around him, officers who had built careers on composure were struggling to maintain their bearing. Every morning I water them. Vernon continued, the words flowing now like blood from a wound that had waited too long for treatment. Every morning I speak their names. Tell them I'm still here, still trying, still carrying them the way I should have carried them out of that jungle. You did carry them. Stone stepped closer, his voice fierce. You carried 3 wounded men through miles of hostile territory. You went back into the kill zone twice. You held a position for 14 hours against a force that should have overrun you in minutes. Vernon shook his head. I carried some of them. Not all. Not enough. You carried what you could. Stone's hand returned to Vernon's shoulder, gripping now with intensity. And then you spent 30 years carrying their memory. That's not failure, Spectre. That's devotion. The name hit Vernon like a physical force. He hadn't heard it spoken by someone who knew what it meant in 3 decades. Hadn't heard it spoken with respect instead of abstraction. The after-action reports. Stone's voice carried across the gathering crowd, loud enough for everyone to hear. I've read them 100 times. Used them in training exercises at Fort Bragg. The operation is studied at every special operations school in the country. Vernon's eyes widened. They call it the Aishau miracle. Stone continued. 12 men against a battalion. 14 hours of contact. For survivors. 7 bodies recovered despite impossible odds. And all of it led by a team leader whose call sign became legend. Sir, Vernon's voice emerged as barely a whisper. I was just doing my job. Stone shook his head. His eyes swept across the crowd that had gathered, taking in the cadets and officers and staff who had come to witness something they didn't yet fully understand. Colonel Whitmore. The general's voice cracked like a whip. Whitmore stepped forward, his face ashen, his earlier arrogance stripped away by the magnitude of his error. Sir, this man you've been threatening. Stone's tone carried ice. This groundskeeper you want to remove from the premises. Do you know who he is? Whitmore's voice emerged small. I'm beginning to understand, sir. Master Sergeant Vernon Thaddeus Calhoun. Stone turned back to Vernon, his bearing shifting to formal military address. United States Army Special Forces. Attached to Military Assistance Command Vietnam, Studies and Observations Group. 3 silver stars. 2 bronze stars with Valor Device. 2 Purple Hearts. Recommended for the Medal of Honor in an action so classified the paperwork never processed. The words fell like hammer blows. Around them, officers had begun to straighten, to come to attention without being ordered. Vernon stood frozen. The titles and honors he had walked away from, the recognition he had rejected for 30 years, poured over him like water over Stone. You were listed as MIA, presumed Kia. Stone's voice softened. When you stopped responding to VA communications, stopped cashing pension checks, we assumed the worst. Search teams looked for you for years. Vernon's response came out as barely a breath. I didn't want to be found, sir. Why? Because I'm the one who came home. Vernon's eyes glistened with tears he had not shed in 3 decades. And they didn't. Every morning I wake up, and they don't. Every breath I take is a breath they'll never draw. Every year I survive is a year they were denied. He looked toward the trees, toward the oaks he had planted and tended and loved. I couldn't live with the rewards, sir. Couldn't accept what they would never receive. So I came here, found a place where I could be useful without being noticed, where I could honor them without explaining why. Stone was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried the authority of a man who had made a decision. It's time to stop punishing yourself for surviving, Spectre. It's time to let us honor what you did. He turned to face the crowd. Tomorrow morning, this garden. Stone's voice carried across the silent grounds. We're going to dedicate these trees properly. Every general attending the ceremony is going to stand at attention while we read the names of the men who died in that jungle. His eyes found Vernon's, and the man who carried them home is finally going to take his place among the honored. The sun had begun its descent toward the Virginia hills, casting long shadows across the memorial garden. The crowd that had gathered showed no signs of dispersing. If anything, it had grown as word spread through the academy and beyond. Phones had appeared in hands. Messages were being sent. The story of the groundskeeper was already beginning its journey into the wider world. Vernon stood at the center of his trees, surrounded by people for the first time in 3 decades. The sensation was overwhelming, disorienting, like stepping from a dark room into blinding light. Command Sergeant Major Barnwell approached slowly, his beret still clutched against his chest. His eyes were red-rimmed, and his voice trembled when he spoke. My father talked about you every day of his life. Barnwell stopped an arm's length away. Every single day. He said you were the reason he got to watch me grow up, the reason he got to hold his grandchildren. Vernon's throat tightened. Leonard was a good soldier, brave, stubborn as hell. He said you told him every man was worth it. Barnwell's voice broke. He said those words save his life before you ever picked him up. Vernon remembered. The jungle darkness. The kid bleeding out and begging to be left behind. The conversation that had felt like nothing at the time, but had apparently echoed through 40 years and 2 generations. I meant it. Vernon's response came out rough. Every man, every single one. Barnwell drew himself to attention. His hand came up in a salute so crisp it could have been used in a training manual. For my father, Master Sergeant, and for me, thank you for bringing him home. Vernon's hand rose automatically, muscle memory overriding 30 years of civilian existence. He returned the salute with a precision that surprised even himself. Around them, officers and cadets followed Barnwell's lead. One by one, hands came up in tribute. The garden filled with the silent respect of warriors honoring one of their own. Vernon held the salute until Barnwell's hand dropped. Then his own fell to his side, trembling. Cadet Okonkwo emerged from the crowd, her tablet computer replaced by a small notebook she clutched like a lifeline. Her face was streaked with tears she hadn't bothered to wipe away. "Mr. Cal." Her voice wavered. "I mean, Master Sergeant. I've been researching SOG for 6 months, writing about ghosts, and I had no idea." Vernon managed something close to a smile. "That was the point. Mississippi ghosts aren't supposed to be seen." She shook her head fiercely. "No, you don't understand. Frederick Okonkwo, one of the names you spoke. One of the 11. Vernon's breath stopped. The name hung in the air between them, suddenly transformed from historical abstraction to present reality. "He was my grandfather's brother." Okonkwo's voice cracked. "My great-uncle. My grandmother kept his photograph on her dresser until the day she died. She never knew what happened to him, just that he went to Vietnam and never came home." Vernon's hand found the bark of the nearest tree. The 4th oak, the one he had planted for Frederick Okonkwo on an April morning 16 years ago. "This one." His voice emerged as barely a whisper. "This is Frederick's tree." Okonkwo stared at the oak, as if seeing it for the first time. Her hand rose slowly, trembling, until her palm pressed flat against the bark. "You planted a tree for him." She spoke through tears. "You've been tending his grave for 16 years. Every morning." Vernon nodded. "I tell him I'm still here, still trying." She turned to face him, and suddenly she was in his arms, sobbing against his chest. Vernon froze for a moment, unaccustomed to contact, unequipped for comfort. Then something ancient and paternal rose up from wherever he had buried it, and his arms closed around her. He was brave. Vernon spoke softly against her hair. "Frederick, he was brave and kind, and he sang gospel hymns when we were on patrol, because he said it kept the fear away." Okonkwo's sobs intensified, but she didn't pull away. "He talked about his family constantly." Vernon continued. "About a brother back home who was going to be a doctor. About nieces and nephews he couldn't wait to meet. He never met them." Okonkwo's voice came out muffled. "My father was born 3 months after Frederick died." Vernon closed his eyes. The weight of it pressed down on him. The generations lost. The connections severed. The silence that had stretched across decades and continents. "I'm sorry." The words felt inadequate, but he spoke them anyway. "I'm sorry I couldn't bring him home alive." Okonkwo pulled back, her eyes meeting his. "You brought him home." She gestured at the tree. "You planted him in this soil. You've been visiting him every day for 16 years. That's more than the Army ever did. More than anyone ever did." General Stone approached, his expression softened by the scene he had witnessed. "Miss Okonkwo." His voice was gentle. "I'm going to need your help tomorrow. We're going to read the names of the 11. Tell their stories. And I think Frederick's story should be told by family." Okonkwo straightened, wiping her eyes. "Yes, sir. I will be honored." Stone nodded, then turned to Vernon. "We need to talk about tomorrow. About what happens next." Vernon looked around the garden, at the crowd that had gathered, at the phones still recording, at the life he had built on anonymity crumbling around him. "I don't know how to do this, sir." His voice carried the particular vulnerability of a man facing something more frightening than combat. "I've been invisible for 30 years. I don't know how to be seen." Stone's hand found his shoulder again. "You don't have to know." The general's voice was kind. "You just have to show up. We'll handle the rest." Vernon's eyes moved across the 11 oaks, across the trees he had planted and tended and loved, across the graves of brothers who had trusted him with their lives and their deaths. "Tomorrow morning." Vernon's voice steadied. "I'll be here, with them, like I've been every morning for 23 years. Stone nodded. "That's all we're asking. That's all any of us have ever asked." The evening light deepened around them. The crowd began to disperse, slowly and reluctantly, carrying with them a story they would tell for the rest of their lives. and Vernon stood among his trees, surrounded by the living for the first time in 30 years, no longer quite so certain that he had no right to be among them. The night passed in a blur of phone calls and preparations. Stone had commandeered the Academy's communications center, reaching out to contacts across the military establishment. Files were being pulled from classified archives. Families were being located. A ceremony that should have taken weeks to organize was being assembled in hours through sheer force of will and the particular urgency that comes when legends are discovered alive. Vernon sat alone in his cottage, unable to sleep, unwilling to leave. The footlocker stood open beside his cot, its contents spread across the worn blanket. Photographs, medals, dog tags, the artifacts of a life he had tried to leave behind. He picked up Ezekiel's tags and held them against his chest. The metal was warm from hours of contact, worn smooth by 30 years of handling. Tomorrow's going to be different, brother. Vernon spoke into the darkness. Tomorrow everyone's going to know. I don't know if I'm ready for that. The wind moved through the trees outside his window, and for a moment he could almost hear a response. Almost feel the weight of a young man's hand on his shoulder. Dawn arrived with the particular clarity that Virginia reserves for days of consequence. Vernon rose before the sun, dressed in the cleanest clothes he owned, and walked to the memorial garden. The transformation stopped him in his tracks. 11 bronze plaques had been installed overnight, one at the base of each tree. Flags had been placed in precise formation around the garden's perimeter. Folding chairs had been arranged in concentric circles around the central bench. A small podium stood where Vernon usually knelt to tend the roots, and people were already arriving, not just officers and cadets, civilians in dark suits and somber dresses, elderly men in VFW caps and faded unit patches, families clutching photographs of young men who would never grow old. Vernon froze at the garden's edge, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was unfolding. A hand touched his elbow. General Stone stood beside him, dressed in full ceremonial uniform, his chest heavy with decorations. We made some calls last night. Stone's voice was gentle. Found some families. They want to be here. Vernon's throat closed around words that wouldn't come. The Crow family is here. Stone continued. Ezekiel's sister. She's 73 now. Brought her grandchildren. Vernon's knees nearly buckled. Ezekiel's sister. The little girl who had written letters to her brother in Vietnam. The child who had never understood why he stopped writing back. She wants to meet you. Stone's hand steadied him. When you're ready. No pressure. Vernon nodded, unable to speak. The ceremony began at 0900 hours precisely. Stone stood at the podium, facing a crowd that had swelled beyond the garden's boundaries. Cadets lined the perimeter. Officers stood at attention. And at the center, seated on the stone bench he had occupied for 23 years of solitary mornings, Vernon waited. We gather today to correct an oversight that has lasted 3 decades. Stone's voice carried across the silent assembly. To honor men whose sacrifice was classified into invisibility, and to recognize a soldier who has spent 30 years honoring them in ways the rest of us failed to imagine. He turned toward Vernon. Master Sergeant Vernon Thaddeus Calhoun, call sign Spectre. Would you please stand? Vernon rose on legs that felt uncertain. The weight of hundreds of eyes pressed against him. The silence was absolute. Stone began to read from the file in his hands. On March 11th, 1971, a 12-man Special Forces team crossed into Laos on a reconnaissance mission designated Operation Prairie Fire. They were ambushed by an NVA battalion approximately 6 miles inside hostile territory. The words fell like stones, each one carrying weight that only Vernon could fully measure. For 14 hours, the team leader held his unit together against overwhelming odds. He personally carried 3 wounded men to covered positions. He returned twice into active fire zones to retrieve fallen teammates. He coordinated air support while providing suppressive fire. And when the extraction helicopter finally arrived, he ensured that every surviving man boarded before him. Stone looked up from the file. 4 men survived that night because of his actions. 7 bodies were recovered because he refused to leave them behind. And for the next 30 years, 11 men were remembered because he planted trees in their honor and tended them every morning of his life. The crowd sat motionless. Some wept openly. Others gripped the hands of people beside them. Stone set down the file and walked to stand directly before Vernon. Master Sergeant Calhoun, it is my privilege to inform you that your Medal of Honor recommendation has been located and reinstated. The President will be notified. A formal ceremony will be scheduled. Vernon shook his head. Sir, I don't want. Stone held up his hand. I know, and we'll discuss that later. But right now, there are 11 families who want to meet the man who brought their sons and brothers home. He stepped aside, and Vernon saw them for the first time. Rows of civilians rising from their seats. Old women clutching photographs. Middle-aged men and women with their children. Entire families linked across generations by bonds of grief and gratitude. At the front stood a small woman with silver hair and Ezekiel Crow's eyes. She held a framed photograph against her chest, a young man in uniform smiling at the camera with the particular confidence of someone who believed he would live forever. Vernon's composure shattered. Tears streamed down his face as the woman approached. She was crying too, but she was also smiling. You're him. Her voice trembled. You're the one Ezekiel wrote about in his letters. The one he called brother. Vernon could only nod. She reached up with her free hand and touched his face. The touch was gentle, maternal, full of a grief that had transformed over decades into something like grace. Thank you, she whispered the words, for carrying him, for remembering him, for planting his tree. Vernon's voice emerged broken, shattered into fragments by emotion he had suppressed for 30 years. I'm sorry. The words came out as a sob. I'm sorry I couldn't save him. She shook her head fiercely. You did save him. Every morning for 23 years. You saved him from being forgotten. That's more than anyone else ever did. She pulled him into an embrace, and Vernon wept against the shoulder of a woman he had never met but had loved by proxy for 3 decades. Around them, other families began to move forward. The Okonkwo family, the Chun family, the Barnwell family, Leonard's widow clutching the hand of her son, the sergeant major, each carrying photographs, each carrying grief that had hardened into gratitude, each ready to meet the man who had carried their loved ones home. The ceremony continued for 3 hours. Each family took their turn at their loved one's tree. Each name was read aloud with full military honors. Each story was told by people who had carried it for decades, waiting for an audience that finally existed. Vernon stood at the center of it all, accepting embraces from strangers who felt like family. His face was raw from tears he had stopped trying to hide. His hands shook with exhaustion and emotion. But he remained upright, remained present, remained visible in a way he had not allowed himself to be for 30 years. General Stone read each citation. The silver stars, the bronze stars, the purple hearts, decorations that had gathered dust in classified files while their recipient planted trees and spoke to the dead. When the formal portion concluded, Stone approached Vernon with a question that had been waiting. The Medal of Honor ceremony will take place in Washington. The general's voice was quiet, meant only for Vernon. The president will present it personally. Will you accept? Vernon looked across the garden, at the families gathered around trees he had planted, at Ezekiel's sister teaching her grandchildren the names of men who had died before they were born, at Cadet Okonkwo standing with her parents beside Frederick's oak, her father weeping openly for an uncle he had never met. I'll accept. Vernon's voice came out steadier than he expected. But not for me. For them. So their names get spoken in a place where people have to listen. Stone nodded. That's exactly right. Movement at the garden's edge caught Vernon's attention. Colonel Whitmore stood apart from the crowd, his uniform immaculate, but his posture defeated. He had watched the entire ceremony from a distance, face pale, hands clasped behind his back. Vernon began walking toward him. Stone caught his arm. You don't have to do that. Vernon looked back. Yes, sir. I do. He crossed the garden slowly, giving Whitmore time to see him coming. The colonel straightened as Vernon approached, his expression shifting through fear and shame and something that might have been resignation. Master Sergeant. Whitmore's voice came out rough. I owe you an apology that words cannot adequately express. Vernon stopped an arm's length away. He studied the younger man's face, seeing for the first time the uncertainty beneath the arrogance, the fear beneath the ambition, the human being beneath the uniform. Colonel, do you know why I never told anyone who I was? Whitmore shook his head. Because it stopped mattering. Vernon's voice carried no accusation. The day I put my brothers in the ground, everything I had accomplished became irrelevant. Medals don't bring back the dead. Rank doesn't ease the grief. The only thing that mattered was remembering them. And I could do that just as well as a groundskeeper as I could as a decorated soldier. Whitmore's eyes glistened. I judged you by your appearance, by your position. I assumed that because you looked like nothing, you were nothing. Vernon nodded slowly. You did, and I was wrong. Yes. The silence stretched between them, filled with the distant sounds of families sharing stories and children playing among the trees. I've spent my entire career trying to prove I deserve my family's legacy. Whitmore's voice cracked. Third-generation military. 2 generals in my bloodline. And I've never once done anything that actually mattered. Vernon considered this. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out the leather pouch. He opened it, revealing the 11 small bags of soil. You want to know what matters, Colonel? Vernon held up the pouch. This matters. Remembering the people who trusted you. Honoring the ones who didn't come home. That's what matters. Whitmore stared at the pouch, at the soil that represented graves scattered across a jungle on the other side of the world. How do I make this right? His voice was barely audible. What I did to you? What I said? How do I fix it? Vernon considered the question carefully. Then he turned and pointed toward the garden, toward the families and the trees and the newly installed bronze plaques. Those families are going to need support. Vernon's voice was calm. Connections to resources. Help navigating the VA system. Someone with authority who can cut through bureaucracy and make things happen. Whitmore straightened slightly. General Stone mentioned you might be reassigned. Vernon continued. That you might spend some time working with veteran services. The colonel nodded. He suggested I learn what I never understood. Then learn it. Vernon held his gaze. Don't do it as punishment. Do it because those families deserve someone who will fight for them. Because every veteran walking into a VA office deserves someone who sees them as a person, not a problem. Whitmore was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had changed. Softer, humbler. Master Sergeant, I spent 2 days treating you like dirt beneath my shoes. And now you're offering me a path to redemption. Vernon shrugged. I spent 30 years punishing myself for surviving. It didn't help anyone, least of all me. He looked back toward the garden, toward Ezekiel's tree. We don't heal by hurting ourselves, Colonel. We heal by helping others. That's what I should have learned decades ago. Maybe you can learn it faster than I did. Whitmore came to attention. His hand rose in a salute that held none of the performance of his earlier bearing. This salute was real, earned, offered from a place of genuine respect. Vernon returned it. The ceremony will conclude soon. Vernon lowered his hand. You should join the families. Listen to their stories. That's where the learning starts. Whitmore nodded. Then, before Vernon could turn away, he spoke again. The garden. Your trees. They're the most beautiful thing on this entire campus. I'm sorry I ever threatened to take them from you. Vernon allowed himself a small smile. The first genuine smile that had crossed his face in longer than he could remember. They're not my trees, Colonel. They never were. They belong to 11 men who gave everything they had. I just tend them until I can join them. He walked back toward the garden, toward the families and the trees and the future he had never expected to have. And behind him, Colonel Bradley Whitmore III stood alone, finally understanding what service truly meant. 3 months passed like water, finding its way to the sea. The autumn leaves fell and were raked into neat piles. The winter frost came and retreated. The first green shoots of spring emerged from soil that had been tended with love for nearly a quarter century. Vernon still rose before dawn, still walked to the memorial garden as the sky lightened from black to gray to pale Virginia blue, still touched each tree and spoke each name with the reverence of a man performing sacred ritual. But now he was not alone, for figures moved through the garden beside him, their hands learning the rhythms he had practiced for 23 years. 3 young veterans from the rehabilitation program that General Stone had established in Vernon's name, and one older man whose presence still surprised Vernon every time he saw it. Bradley Whitmore wore civilian clothes now, jeans and a work shirt, boots that had actually touched soil. His hands, once immaculate, bore the calluses of honest labor. The former colonel had resigned his commission 6 weeks after the ceremony, had enrolled in the veteran outreach program he had been assigned to oversee, had shown up at Vernon's cottage one morning with a request that still echoed in Vernon's memory. "Teach me." Whitmore had stood in the doorway, stripped of rank and pretense. "Teach me what you know. About the trees. About the men. About what it means to serve something larger than myself." Vernon had studied him for a long moment. Then he had handed him a watering can. Now Whitmore knelt beside the youngest oak, Marcus Tolley's tree, his fingers working compost into the soil with growing competence. The 3 younger veterans spread across the garden. Corporal Elena Vasquez, who had lost her left arm to an IED in Kandahar. Sergeant Thomas Brightwater, who still woke screaming from dreams of Fallujah. Private First Class David Kim, whose body had healed faster than his mind from wounds sustained in a place he never spoke about. Stone's program had brought them here, a new initiative for veterans struggling to reintegrate. Groundskeeping therapy, the paperwork called it, but Vernon called it what it really was. Learning to tend something, learning to watch it grow, learning that survival could become purpose. He stopped at Ezekiel's tree, his palm pressing flat against bark worn smooth by decades of contact. "Morning, brother." Vernon's voice was soft, but no longer lonely. "Got some new people for you to meet. They're hurting like I was, but they're trying, just like I tried." The wind moved through the branches, carrying the scent of spring and the distant sound of cadets running their morning drills. Corporal Vasquez approached, her remaining hand cradling a small potted sapling. "Master Sergeant." Her voice carried the particular respect of one soldier addressing another. "The nursery delivered this morning. What do you want it?" Vernon turned to study the sapling. A young oak, barely 2 feet tall, its leaves unfurling with the desperate optimism of new growth. "What's it for?" She hesitated. "General Stone's program. He wants to expand the garden. Plant a tree for every veteran who comes through the rehabilitation center." Vernon considered this. The garden he had built for 11 men, growing into something larger, something that would outlast him, something that would continue long after he joined his brothers in whatever came next. "Over there." He pointed to an open space at the garden's eastern edge. "Morning sun hits there first. Good soil. Room to grow." Vasquez nodded and moved to prepare the ground. Vernon watched her work, watching all of them work, and felt something shift in his chest. A loosening, a release. The weight he had carried for 30 years settling into a different configuration. He was still the keeper of 11 graves, still the guardian of 11 names. But now he was something else too. A teacher, a guide, a man whose survival had finally found its purpose. Footsteps approached from the main campus. Vernon turned to find Cadet Okonkwo walking toward him, a bound document clutched against her chest. She had graduated 2 weeks ago, top of her class. Her thesis on MACSOG had won national recognition and been published in 3 military journals. But she had deferred her commission for 6 months, choosing to stay at Crestwood and work with Stone's program, choosing to learn from Vernon. "Master Sergeant." She stopped before him, her eyes bright. The publisher called. They want to expand the thesis into a full book. The Gardens of the Ghost. Stories of hidden memorials and the veterans who tend them. Vernon raised an eyebrow. "A book." She nodded. "They want to tell your story. Not just the operation. Not just the garden. Everything. The 30 years. The families. What you built here." He was quiet for a long moment. The idea of his story in print, available to anyone, felt like standing naked in a crowded room. Then he looked at the trees, at the plaques bearing 11 names, at the new sapling being planted for a future he wouldn't live to see. "One condition." His voice was steady. "Name it." "The book isn't about me." Vernon met her eyes. "It's about them. Ezekiel and Leonard and Eddie and Marcus and Thomas and James and Samuel and Frederick and David and Michael and Robert. Their stories, their sacrifice, their families. Okonkwo smiled. That's exactly what I told the publisher. She reached in her pocket and pulled out a small object. A challenge coin, freshly minted. On one side, the SOG skull and crossbones. On the other, 11 oak trees arranged in a circle. General Stone had these made. She pressed the coin into Vernon's palm. For everyone who completes the program. To remind them that surviving isn't betraying the dead. It's honoring them. Vernon stared at the coin. His vision blurred with tears he no longer tried to hide. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the garden. The young veterans continued their work. Whitmore wiped soil from his hands. Vasquez patted earth around the new sapling's roots. And Vernon Thaddeus Calhoun, call sign Spectre, stood among his trees and finally understood what Ezekiel had meant all those years ago. Finish the call, brother. Get them home. He had spent 30 years thinking those words meant carrying bodies to helicopters, carrying guilt through decades of silence, carrying weight that should have crushed him. But now he understood. Getting them home meant keeping them alive in memory, meant teaching others to remember, meant building something that would outlast his own heartbeat and carry their names into a future they would never see. Still here, brother. Vernon whispered the words to the wind and the trees and the sky. Still trying. And finally, I think I understand. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that heroes don't always wear their medals and that healing is possible even after decades of silence, please subscribe to this channel. And tell us in the comments, who is the quiet hero in your life? Who deserves to be seen? Sometimes the greatest warriors are the ones still tending gardens, still speaking names, still refusing to let the dead be forgotten. Thank you for watching. The camera pulls back. 11 oaks stand in their perfect circle. New saplings at the eastern edge. Veterans work the soil with hands learning to heal. And at the center, an old man touches the bark of the oldest tree and smiles. Some ghosts don't want to stay invisible forever. And some gardens grow more than trees. They grow redemption and healing and hope.